Hi everyone, welcome to First Grade Math Stories. This is Greta Anderson. I'm one of the Navigator coaches. Let's jump in. This is our first self-directed learning module, and so before we even get into any of the math, what I'd love to talk about is what are the self-directed learning modules. They're interactive modules that you will learn a little bit more about. They're to be completed in grade level teams, but they can also be completed individually by teachers if someone's absent on the day that you guys review this, if maybe there's a co-teacher who you think would benefit from seeing this as well. They should take up to an hour, but we'll talk about ways to take that time down a little bit. Every SDL will have a video, which you're watching now, so it'll be a file that you click on and can watch and pause as needed. And there will be a quiz component, which is a Google form that has embedded feedback. So when you submit your answers, you'll then see the right answers or any guiding notes that might be helpful. The thing I ask is that every person participating take a quiz. If you are hearing my voice, please take a quiz. It helps us really know from a broad range of stakeholders, like what is the right content to set you up to serve kids the best. And I'm not just talking about Navigator schools. We have some pilot schools who are also watching this module. So please help us do our best work by taking the quiz. And the purpose of the SDL experience is to convey how and why content builds over the course of a month. So in terms of maximizing team time, maybe you don't have a full hour to set aside for this. Some of it can be assigned as pre-work. So reading the content overview and the math stories guide and reading the month overview and the problem set, both of those can be assigned as pre-reading, and that's the only pre-work you should ever have for this. And the first part of the quiz will always be a basic check on their reading to ensure that the teachers and leaders get the key takeaways. So whenever you're wondering what is the pre-work that we should read, when are the modules coming out, where is a link to that thing that we learned about, this one document has everything. So take a second just to make sure that you have this bit.ly address saved. And when you're ready, meet me on the next slide. So our objectives are that we'll be able to plan for a successful rollout of math stories in first grade and establish the concrete and pictorial stages of the CPA cycle as the foundation for more rigorous problem solving. And we will do that through these series of basic parts of the SDL, and this will happen every single SDL. We'll go from an overview to the research, we'll do some math, we'll stamp the key points, and then I'll always leave time to talk about some frequently asked questions that normally come up for teachers around this time of year. So let's start by grounding in the year-long scope and sequence. This is what first grade looks like across the year. The big thing I want you to know for September is September in first grade is actually just doing the kindergarten problems that those kindergarten problem types they've already seen. If you are in your first year of implementing math stories, you will not see any both add-ins unknown problems in the problem sets. They are just a different type of problem and take a little bit more, just a different type of IPP. So we took those out. If you're in your second year plus, please start weaving in both add-ins unknown problems into the problem sets. So let's ground in this month's overview and problem set. So if you haven't already, just open this bit.ly link, go to the September pre-work for first grade, and I want you to read it. And then there are two jobs. When you're ready, your team is going to discuss what would you describe as the big goals of the first month of first grade. And then there are also two comprehension checks just for the reading that you did. So quiz questions 1 and 2. So you're going to meet me on the next slide when you're ready, but otherwise just hit pause. So hopefully you and your team hit on these key ideas for big goals for first grade. Establishing routines in math stories language, promoting a growth mindset, and empowering students to represent using real-life objects, counters, and written representations. We are not going to talk a lot about the first two in this module today. If you want resources for growth mindset, we have a series of growth mindset presentations, and those are accessible if you go to that bit.ly for the SDL module overview. You can see where we have all of our mindset presentations saved. You are welcome to take a look at them. Let's talk about the research. So we'll talk a lot about the concrete pictorial abstract learning progression in math. And you will see this lived out every month of the first grade math stories experience. It's critical that students start with real life objects, which is why this year may feel different to you than prior years. We're actually asking people to start with buttons. You don't need to use buttons. You can use anything you have a class set of, like shells, puffs, whatever. But we want the story. We want kids to be handling the objects from the story. They'll move from there to counters. Later in the year, they'll get into tape diagrams, and they also may at any point be using equations as well. So right here, I have a really nice overview of this CPA progression. This is from Singapore Math. Just take about a minute to read this silently, and when you're ready, just join me on the next slide. So here's your discussion question. I'd like you to skim over the September problem set. What evidence do you see of the CPA cycle? And when you're ready, join me on the next slide. So hopefully you hit on the real-life manipulatives and the gradual transfer to counters and one-to-one. One thing I want to draw attention to, even when we think about counters, it's important that there's a gradual release there. So you'll notice as in any month of math stories, the counters will initially be used to represent either the thing they used to represent with the real life object as an aha, like, oh, we can use counters to represent buttons. Or something like stickers where the counter looks a lot like stickers. So you can see a gradual move away. Right, they start with counters being stickers, which is a pretty close fit, and then apples and strawberries, where it's an okay fit. And then they're using one-to-one encounters to represent things that don't resemble counters: girls, boys, books, dogs. So this is a very deliberate sequence that should move students to deep understanding. I'm going to ask you to pause and to take quiz question 3. When you're ready, meet me on the next slide. So again, the CPA cycle is really the heart of the entire first grade math stories experience. And we're going to keep that in mind as we reflect on individual problems. If you have counters, please get them and make sure you have something to write with. We're going to take a look at these 3 problems from the problem set. You can see that they're bolded. They're ones that I recommend that you go through with your coach. And it also has a suggested key point on the right. For each of these, I'm going to ask you to rep in multiple ways. With this problem about Ava and her buttons, when you're doing this with students, they're actually only going to use buttons. But for your own sense of seeing where this is going, I'm going to ask you to rep with all 3. So take however long it takes you to represent this. If you're not familiar with tape diagrams, it's okay just to say you're not sure, and then I'll show you the representations on the next slide, and that will help you align for the future. So go ahead and pause and meet me on the next slide when you're ready. Good. So hopefully you have some kind of representation like the one above. You'll see that spaces are really helpful when kids are distinguishing different groups like this. Kids may also use attributes to distinguish the 2 separate groups. Maybe they'll put the black buttons to be the ones that she already had and green buttons to be the ones that she found. Either way, we can see how this builds to a tape diagram. Right? We can see that it's a generic rectangle that represents what students would have done with buttons, with counters, with one-to-one circles. The next problem I'm going to ask you to represent is this one about Mr. Johnson. Again, I'm going to ask you to rep it in multiple ways, even though students will not be doing all of these ways. Meet me on the next slide when you're ready. Great. This should be a nice one for students to use counters, especially with their red stickers, yellow stickers. There should be a really nice way for them to show that visually. They could also create a representation with one-to-one later in the year. Kids will often use that little line to show the separation of two separate groups, and eventually they'll move on to tape diagrams. If as you're watching, you're wondering, what if my kids want to organize by 5s or by 10s? That's totally fine. The linear version will eventually give way to tape diagrams, which is helpful, but know that your first graders may do different configurations, and that's totally fine. What matters is that it's an organized way to keep track of the stickers, the counters, whatever they're representing. And the last problem I want you to do that's from the first month is this one with Kaylee and the cats and the dogs. Meet me on the next slide when you're ready. Great. And again, this is the first one that they'll do with one-to-one. I should have put in a little separating line or some annotation to show which are the cats and which is the dogs. They might use different symbols. They might choose labels. Either way, you can see that this is going to be sometime soon a direct link to the tape diagram. So we'll usually in our SDLs do some of the problems in the upcoming month, but sometimes I also find it helpful to look much farther ahead so you can think about what you need to get right this month. So these problems are going to be a little bit harder. I'd like you to take a moment just to create representations with buttons or counters and a tape diagram, and just start with the first one. Meet me on the next slide when you're ready. So hopefully you're seeing the 12 buttons. Of them, some fell off and there are 7 left. We can see all 12 buttons there. Maybe students would just separate the piles. Either way, we can see each counter is a button. We can also see what that would look like on the tape diagram. The next problem is going to feel different. I want you to create a representation with counters and to create a tape diagram. I'll meet you on the next slide where we can take a look at how these are different. So you can see the representation with the counters and with the tape diagram looks a lot different than the take from change unknown and from the ones we've done so far. Before moving on to talk about why, I actually want you to stop and take the quiz questions 4 through 6. Meet me on the next slide when you're ready. So I want you to talk with your team. Why is it so critical to build a foundation with real-life materials and counters, even if students can produce the correct answers in month 1 of first grade math stories? Go ahead and discuss and then meet me on the next slide when you're ready. I have another discussion question for you too that should push your thinking. In the past, students may have used the diagrams below. They are sometimes called bar models. Common Core calls them static diagrams to represent both of these problems. I want you to talk about why are tape diagrams a stronger representation than bar models or static diagrams. So turn and talk. Meet me on the next slide when you're ready. Great. So I want to name, the tape diagrams show much stronger and deeper understanding. For anyone who's been with Navigator for at least a year, you've noticed in the past we've used bar models or static diagrams and that they're no longer in the guide. This is why. And this is why I had you take time to represent all of those total unknown, result unknown problems in addition to some change unknown and comparison, because students that really have a strong grounding in one-to-one, right, in using the counters, will graduate to tape diagrams. You can see here, the tape diagrams shown show such deep understanding. They know in that Malia and Harris problem that 7 isn't the number of spiders, right? 7 is actually the relationship between Malia's spiders and Harris's spiders. We know Malia has 6 and we know Harris has 7 more, but we want to be able to see what that looks like and to know that a student understands that 7 is the relationship, it's the difference. We can't tell that from a bar model. We also can't tell if a student understands the difference between a part-whole problem and a comparison problem, and that is the heart of first grade. So we want to take even the first month of first grade with these problems for results unknown and really lay a solid foundation so then kids could go to change unknown, right? Like that buttons on the jacket problem that's coming up next month. And then the Malia-Harris problem comes up in December. So we want to lean in towards tape diagrams eventually and not towards bar models or static diagrams. If we do that well, we should see much deeper understanding and much stronger student performance. And it begins with modeling with the concrete, then abstracting that to representing that same thing with counters, eventually tape diagrams and equations. The beautiful thing about tape diagrams is this one representation spans their entire math careers. In first grade, you're just going to be working on that left side, part-whole models and additive comparison, where again, we understand that the difference is a relationship. It's not the actual quantity that would be represented with a counter. We can also see on the right side, that same idea is going to transfer to equal groups multiplication, to fractions, and fourth grade multiplicative compare, and eventually in middle school to ratio reasoning. So we are moving much more aggressively towards tape diagram as a program. Again, the research base is very strong. It's the CPA progression that has really been owned by a lot of high-performing countries. In terms of continuity, there's no mixed messages. It's the same representation used for fractions, ratios, algebra, and alignment. Any post-Common Core curriculum is moving here because the research is so clear about the CPA progression. So a lot of our partners use different core curricula. Some use Engage New York or Eureka. Illustrative is coming out with their elementary curriculum in 2 years. I know some partners use Curriculum and Associates and some use Zern. Any of these will have the same tape diagrams, so it should also promote just clearer connections from math stories to your core class. We're going to close with some frequently asked questions. A big one that always comes up is, how will my students share button representations if they can't hold up their boards to share? So a few things. When using manipulatives, it's just more helpful to have students sit shoulder to shoulder instead of facing each other. I also put some 2 to 3 share options below. You need to find what works best for you. This is Miss Doherty. She is a kindergarten teacher in Philadelphia. You can see that students rep individually. This student is using counters, but he repped on his whiteboard, and he brings it up and she holds it so that the class can see, and then she'll rep the same thing with magnetic counters. Something that's worth noting here, their whiteboards have one glossy side where you would do the writing with a dry erase marker, and then they have that kind of cardboard backside that's much more rough. And so for manipulatives, it really helps to use the rough side of a whiteboard so that they don't slide. In Ms. Paris's class, when students were repping with counters, she just snapped pics with her cell phone, and then she put the cell phone under the doc cam. So the class is still looking at her work, even though she's not bringing it up. And you can see Ms. Paris is also charting the work on this side. Ms. Brathwaite used some kind of image sharing tech, whether it's AirDrop or maybe she's just snapping a pic with her cell phone and sending it to her computer via email. I'm not sure, but she had a different way of tackling the same issue. And this isn't so much for the 2 to 3 share, but this is just thinking about different ways you could do this. This is a first grade student who, in her class, they represent directly on the table with whiteboard markers. So again, what matters is that you find what that works best for you so that students can make their representations and there's an easy way to share them publicly. We close the month with written representations. Should I plan only for seeing one-to-one? Because that is certainly what we've talked a bit about today. And the answer is no. At that point, you'll definitely want to have a student share a one-to-one representation first, but you may also use different one-to-one configurations, a number bond. I doubt that you would see a tape diagram at this point. Maybe you will, or an equation, but these different visual reps are all helpful. If you see a bar model, I want you to think it's not wrong, but do not use the bar model for the 2 to 3 share. You'll want to establish clear boundaries for part, whole, and comparison problems, and you really need to stay away from bar models to get that right. So let's just circle back on some key points before we close out. Use the first month of first grade math stories to prioritize growth mindset, routines, and a strong start to the concrete pictorial abstract learning cycle. Strong routines and strong representation will be the transferable skills that will help students navigate upcoming challenging problem types. I can't say that enough. I know the problems don't feel quite as challenging, but if they've got the muscle memory with manipulatives and with counters and visuals, they will have a much more successful transition to change unknown next month. And really push for deep understanding for manipulatives and tape diagrams, because if they do that well, they will pave the way for deep understanding of comparison later in the year. So thank you. That is the end of our SDL. The last thing in your quiz is to take the feedback survey. So again, your feedback really matters. And I thank you for your time today.